I want you to imagine a cold Kentucky night in the winter of 1809. The world was still, the forests dark, and inside a rough one-room log cabin, a boy was born who would one day shake the very foundations of a nation. His name, Abraham Lincoln. Now, you may already know the basics: poor family, self-taught lawyer, 16th President of the United States. But today, I want to tell you a story that goes deeper, not just the official version from textbooks, but the one filled with secrets, strange coincidences, and whispers of destiny. Lincoln's childhood was far from ordinary, even if it seemed humble at first glance. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and carpenter, but also a man haunted by bad luck and debts. His mother, Nancy Hanks, came from a family wrapped in mystery. Some historians have quietly debated her ancestry for decades, suggesting that perhaps Lincoln's mother carried a hidden heritage, one that might explain his unusual intellect and striking appearance. There were whispers, though never proven, that Abraham might not have been entirely who people thought he was by blood, and Lincoln himself, later in life, would occasionally drop hints that he felt like an outsider in his own family. But it wasn't just family rumors that shaped him. Lincoln's childhood was marked by death. At just 9 years old, he lost his mother. The cause, something strange: milk sickness. A mysterious illness caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten poisonous plants. Imagine little Abraham watching his mother weaken and die, powerless to stop it. That trauma, that raw confrontation with mortality, never left him. In fact, if you trace Lincoln's speeches later in life, you'll find he often spoke with an almost eerie familiarity about death, sacrifice, and destiny, as if his childhood loss had carved something deep into his soul. But here's where things get even stranger. After Nancy's death, Abraham's father remarried. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, encouraged him to read, and read he did. Yet what he chose wasn't always what other children would pick. He devoured the Bible, Aesop's fables, Shakespeare, and even books on law and strange tales of the supernatural. Lincoln developed an obsession with dreams, omens, and symbols. Years later, he would tell people about his recurring dreams, some of them shockingly accurate predictions of coming events. Now, let's fast forward a little. Picture young Lincoln. As a tall, awkward teenager, he wasn't the handsome, commanding figure we might imagine. In fact, people often mocked his looks, his long limbs, his large hands, his melancholy eyes. And yet, there was something about him. Townspeople said that when he spoke, everyone listened. Even before becoming a lawyer or politician, Lincoln had what people called a strange magnetism. His humor could fill a room, but behind it, there was always this shadow of a deep sadness. And maybe this is where we start to see the making of a legend. He worked as a rail splitter, chopping wood for fences, earning the nickname the Rail Splitter. He wrestled in local matches, gaining a reputation as nearly unbeatable. But alongside the physical strength was something rarer: the ability to win arguments not with fists, but with words. Lincoln's talent for debate began in those small towns, where people would gather around him, mesmerized, while he spoke about fairness, justice, and human dignity. But here's a detail most people don't know: Lincoln's first taste of politics ended in failure. In 1832, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost. He went back to working odd jobs: store clerk, surveyor, even postmaster. And yet, in that time, he built something more valuable than money or titles: connections, trust, and an image of a man who was honest to the bone. That's when people started calling him Honest Abe. Still, let me share something rarely talked about in school books. Lincoln wasn't always the confident, noble figure we remember. He struggled with what we today call clinical depression. His friends called it the melancholy. There are stories of Lincoln sitting alone for hours, staring into the distance, haunted by invisible weights. At least once, his friends even hid his knives, fearing he might harm himself. And yet, he never collapsed under it. Instead, that darkness became part of his strength. It gave him empathy. It gave him the ability to understand suffering, not in theory, but in his very bones. Now, let's move into the part of Lincoln's life that feels almost like a thriller. By the 1840s, he was practicing law, traveling from town to town in Illinois. Picture him, tall and thin, riding on horseback with his legal books in a saddlebag. Walking into courtrooms that were more like theaters than halls of justice. He became famous for his ability to disarm opponents with humor and then strike with razor-sharp logic. But there were enemies too. Lincoln's views on slavery, even in those early years, made him dangerous in the eyes of powerful men. Here's where the hidden side begins to surface. Lincoln, and like many politicians of his day, couldn't ignore slavery. He called it what it was, a moral wrong. But behind closed doors, he admitted something darker. In one private letter, he confessed that slavery was like a disease in America's body, one that might eventually kill the entire nation if not cut out. He predicted conflict long before the Civil War broke out. And some believe that's why, even in the 1840s, there were already whispers of plots against his life. But Lincoln wasn't just facing political enemies. He was also facing himself. Love, for example, was not simple for him. His early romance with Anne Rutledge ended in tragedy when she died young, leaving him heartbroken for years. Some say this loss deepened his melancholy even more. Later, he married Mary Todd, a strong-willed woman from a wealthy family. Their marriage was complicated. She supported his ambitions, but their life together was filled with quarrels, grief, and the terrible loss of children. By the time Lincoln reached the White House, only one of their four sons would still be alive. So, let me pause and ask you this: what makes a leader? Is it wealth, power, or could it be suffering? Could it be the way a person turns wounds into wisdom? By the time Lincoln entered national politics, he was no stranger to either suffering or failure. He had lost elections, lost love, lost children, and lived with the shadow of depression. And yet, he had gained something priceless: the ability to speak to the very heart of ordinary people. Farmers, workers, soldiers, widows, they all felt that Lincoln understood them. And maybe he did. And so, by the 1850s, as America cracked apart over slavery, as the North and South drew battle lines not yet fought with guns but with words, there rose this strange, haunted man from Illinois. Tall as a tree, awkward as a scarecrow, with a voice that could cut through lies like an axe through wood. He was not yet president, not yet the savior of the Union, but already his destiny was moving toward him like a storm on the horizon. And somewhere deep inside, Lincoln knew it. In fact, in one of his famous but rarely discussed letters, he wrote, "I am a piece of driftwood, but perhaps the current has a destination." Little did he know that destination would be the White House, the Civil War, and the fight to define the very meaning of freedom. But before we get there, we must step into the shadows. Because Lincoln's rise to power wasn't just about speeches and votes. It was also about secrets, enemies, and strange premonitions that seemed to follow him all his life. When Abraham Lincoln stepped into the White House in March 1861, he entered not only the grand residence of the presidency, but also a nest of troubles, secrets, and shadows that would follow him until the very end of his life. The world saw him as the tall, awkward lawyer from Illinois, the rail splitter who had risen from poverty to the highest office in the land. But behind those weary eyes, behind that famous beard, Lincoln carried a burden few men in history have borne. And many who lived close to him whispered that the White House itself seemed haunted not only by ghosts of America's past, but by the very consequences of every decision he made. A nation on the brink when Lincoln took office, 11 southern states were already threatening secession. By April, the Civil War had begun with the firing on Fort Sumter. Washington, D.C. was a city under siege, both physically and emotionally. Confederate sympathizers lurked in the Capitol. Vice slipped in and out, and even some within Lincoln's own cabinet doubted his strength. Lincoln was a man who thrived in crisis. But his leadership style was unusual. He loved to tell long, often humorous stories in the middle of strategy meetings. Some officials considered it inappropriate. After all, men were dying on the battlefields, but for Lincoln, storytelling was survival. It was his way of cutting through despair, of reminding people of their shared humanity. What most Americans didn't know was how deeply lonely he felt. The White House, for all its grandeur, was cold, drafty, and eerie. Candles flickered in The long hallways and the air seemed thick with history. Lincoln would often wander the rooms late at night, restless, consumed by thoughts of a country tearing itself apart. The hidden grief of a president Lincoln's personal life was shadowed by tragedy. He and Mary Todd Lincoln had 4 sons. By the time he became president, one had already died. And then, in 1862, their beloved 11-year-old son Willie fell gravely ill with typhoid fever. Lincoln kept his official duties during the day, but at night he sat by Willie's bed, refusing to give up hope. When Willie died in February, Lincoln was devastated. Those who worked at the White House said he became a different man. He cried openly, his long frame shaking with grief. Mary fell into deep depression, turning to seances and spiritualists to try to contact her dead son. And though Lincoln was skeptical, there are records that he attended at least one seance, silently listening as mediums claimed to hear voices from beyond. It was in this period that rumors began to swirl about Lincoln's fascination with death and the supernatural. Did he truly believe in ghosts? One of his closest aides later recalled that Lincoln confided in him about a dream where he saw his own body lying in a coffin in the East Room of the White House, a chilling prophecy. Because 3 years later, that very vision would come true. The secret war of words. While Lincoln faced battles on the fields of Virginia and Tennessee, he also fought secret wars in the newspapers. In the 19th century, the press was brutally partisan. Papers called him everything from a tyrant to a clown. Some claimed he was a dictator for suspending habeas corpus and jailing those accused of aiding the Confederacy. But Lincoln understood something his enemies did not: words could shape destiny. He personally wrote many of his speeches, carefully crafting phrases that would outlive him. His Gettysburg Address was only 272 words long, but it reshaped America's understanding of freedom. Few knew how much time he spent refining such short sentences, pacing back and forth in his study, whispering words to himself, testing how they sounded aloud. What the public never fully realized was that Lincoln also used secret agents to spread information. He relied on a network of informants to track Confederate sympathizers in Washington, and he approved covert operations to sabotage supply lines in the South. The lawyer who once studied law books by firelight had become a commander in the shadows, waging wars the public never saw. The mysterious dreams throughout his presidency. Lincoln was haunted by dreams. He told friends about one in which he was on a strange ship, moving toward an unknown shore. Another time, he dreamed of walking into the East Room of the White House, where he saw a coffin surrounded by soldiers. When he asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" a soldier replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Historians debate whether Lincoln exaggerated these stories, or whether they were reported after his death to create a sense of fate. But what is certain is that Lincoln believed in signs. He often said he felt his life would be cut short, that he was destined not to survive his second term. And still, he pressed on. Lincoln's secret weapon in the darkest days of the war. When defeat seemed near, Lincoln found strength in an unusual place: humor. He collected jokes, read comic plays, and even shared funny anecdotes during meetings about the war. His cabinet members sometimes found it strange, but Lincoln believed humor was a weapon. "It has saved me many times," he once said, when all else would have failed. Some say this was part of his genius, that he understood the human spirit needed laughter to endure suffering. Others whisper it was a mask, hiding the unbearable sorrow inside him. Closing the second chapter by 1864, the Union was turning the tide of war. Lincoln was re-elected, but the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands dead, the South in ruins, the North exhausted. And still, danger surrounded him. Confederate sympathizers plotted in secret. Washington buzzed with rumors of assassination, and Lincoln himself seemed to sense that his time was running short. His strange dreams, his quiet melancholy, his long, shadowed walks through the White House corridors all pointed toward a tragic end. The president who carried the weight of a broken nation was already walking, unknowingly, toward his own final chapter. When Abraham Lincoln walked into Ford's Theater on the evening of April 14, 1865, he carried the weight of history on his shoulders. The Civil War had just ended. The Confederate armies had surrendered. The Union was preserved, but what remained? was perhaps even harder, to stitch back together a nation torn apart by 4 years of bloodshed and generations of division. That night, Lincoln was in a strangely lighthearted mood. According to witnesses, he told his bodyguard, "I feel a great burden has been lifted. Tonight, I am content." The play began, the audience laughed, and for a brief moment, the president allowed himself to exhale. But John Wilkes Booth, an actor with Confederate sympathies and a plan fueled by rage and twisted glory, was moving through the shadows. By the time the laughter rose in the theater, Booth fired his pistol. Lincoln never regained consciousness. The following morning, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton uttered the famous words, "Now he belongs to the ages." The aftermath of a martyrdom. Lincoln's death created shockwaves not only in the United States but across the world. Newspapers in Europe mourned him as a great defender of democracy. Crowds lined the streets as his funeral train traveled from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. Millions wept openly, convinced that no man could replace him, but his assassination also left behind haunting what-ifs. Lincoln had envisioned a softer, more forgiving Reconstruction, a way to welcome the South back into the Union without humiliation, to heal instead of punish. His famous phrase, "with malice toward none, with charity for all," was meant as a roadmap, but with his death, Reconstruction fell into harsher hands. The decades that followed brought racial segregation, violent backlash, and wounds that took more than a century to heal. Some historians still wonder, had Lincoln lived, would America's racial struggles have unfolded differently? Could one man's vision have changed the trajectory of an entire nation? The hidden sides of Lincoln be the end of his life. Abraham Lincoln had become an almost mythical figure. But behind the mythology lay complexities that make him even more fascinating. For one, Lincoln was deeply fascinated by dreams and premonitions. Just days before his assassination, he confided to friends that he had dreamt of walking through the White House and finding mourners everywhere. In the East Room, he said, he saw a coffin guarded by soldiers. When he asked who had died, a voice told him, "The President." Many dismissed it as the product of stress, but the eerie accuracy of the vision has fueled countless discussions. Then there are the mysterious documents, the so-called missing pages of Lincoln's personal papers. Some claim these were destroyed or hidden because they contained controversial thoughts about race, politics, or even doubts about organized religion. While most of this falls into the realm of speculation, it reminds us that Lincoln was not just a public figure but a man with private struggles and fears. Lincoln's radical ideas. What made Lincoln extraordinary was not just that he preserved the Union, it was that he dared to redefine it. His Emancipation Proclamation did not, by itself, free every enslaved person, but it shifted the moral compass of the war. From that moment, the Union was not just fighting for survival, it was fighting for freedom. This was risky. Many in the North opposed emancipation. Soldiers wrote home questioning why they should die for people they didn't know. Politicians warned Lincoln he was committing political suicide. But he pressed forward. "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," he declared. And then, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, he struck the final blow to an institution that had haunted America since its birth. The Lincoln you didn't know. Most people imagine Lincoln as a stern, somber figure, but he had a playful side. He loved telling jokes, often at his own expense. He adored the theater and memorized passages from Shakespeare. He also struggled with what today might be recognized as clinical depression, long spells of melancholy that he fought with humor and relentless work. In fact, some biographers argue that his pain gave him empathy. His lifelong battle with darkness made him uniquely able to connect with the suffering of others. When he spoke of a new birth of freedom, it was not just political, it was deeply human. The global impact of Lincoln's influence extended far beyond America. Leaders across Europe admired him for defending democracy during a time when monarchies still dominated. In Russia, Tsar Alexander II, who abolished serfdom around the same time, was compared to Lincoln as a liberator. In Britain, working class people who had suffered from the cotton shortage caused by the war still celebrated Lincoln as a symbol of freedom. Even today, people around the world invoke his words. His speeches are taught in schools on every continent. His image sits on currency, monuments, and in the hearts of those who see in him a reminder that leadership can come from the humblest of beginnings. The eternal questions, and yet, Abraham Lincoln remains surrounded by mysteries. What would Reconstruction have looked like if he had lived? What did his missing papers contain? Did his prophetic dream reflect chance or something beyond? These unanswered questions keep historians, writers, and ordinary people fascinated. Because Lincoln was not just a man who led a nation, he became a story, one that grows richer the more we uncover. Closing thoughts. Lincoln rose from a log cabin to the highest office in the land. He taught himself through candlelight, battled inner demons, and carried the weight of a fractured country. He freed millions, redefined democracy, and then gave his life before he could see the full fruits of his labor. That is why, more than 150 years later, we still tell his story, not because it is finished, but because it continues to ask us questions about freedom, justice, and the kind of leaders we need. Abraham Lincoln is not just a chapter in America's past. He is a mirror in which every generation sees its struggles and hopes. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all.